And now I want to talk to you about an entirely different kind of frame. In this case, what I'm talking about is based on a book called Is Anyone Responsible? And the author is a guy named Shanto Iyengar for people who are interested in the media and particularly interested in experiments to understand the media. Shanto Iyengar is a big name. One of the things that he did in this book, Is Anyone Responsible, is he looked at how people responded to episodic frames versus thematic frames. So what I want to do is I want to talk about episodic frames, give you an example, talk about thematic frames, give you an example, and then I'm going to show a video that kind of tries to do both. So first, an episodic frame is a frame that focuses on an individual to talk about a bigger image. So for example, if I was owned a news outlet in the Santa Clarita Valley, and I wanted you to do a report on, you're a reporter again, and I wanted you to do a report on homelessness in the Santa Clarita Valley. If you decided to use a episodic frame to tell your story, what you might do is go to a place where you know homeless people are encamped. So for example, suppose you know that there's a homeless guy who lives under a particular bridge in Santa Clarita. So you bring your camera crew down there, you talk to this particular person, you interview him, you show pictures of what it's like underneath the bridge. You get a little bit of his story, and you use his story to talk about homelessness. That would be an episodic frame. You're focusing on this individual to talk about a bigger issue, homelessness in general. If you're doing an episodic frame, you would focus on the bigger issue. So rather than interviewing the homeless guy under the bridge, you would just talk about general patterns that have changed over time. You might interview some experts on homelessness in the Santa Clarita Valley, or experts who talk about the impact of homelessness on society, maybe the impact that it has on children, the impact that it has on students, depending on what you're interested in. But if you focused on the bigger issue, that would be called a thematic frame. If you focus on an individual, that would be an episodic frame. Now, just for a second, I want you to think about this. As I've said before, the primary goal of any journalist is to keep a big audience. You want to have a big audience because you want to keep your job. If you have a big audience, you can sell more advertising. And so that's something that's always in the back of your mind. But if you're a journalist, you probably also want to have an impact on society. So what do? If you're going to do a report, would you prefer to do an episodic? And when you want to change society, meaning you want people to watch your report and then be motivated to take action. If you're a reporter, would you want to do an episodic frame? Or would you want to do a thematic frame? Well, oftentimes students say that they would want to do an episodic frame because they think it would be more personal, would have a more emotional impact on people. And as a result of that emotional impact, it would have a bigger, it might change their behavior in some way. Maybe they'd be motivated to call a congressperson or call their city council or start a church group or something like that, where they're going to try and address the issue of homelessness. And then sometimes students say they do a thematic frame because it provides more information. And so it might be less entertaining, but they really want to emphasize the importance of getting information out to people. Well, episodic frames do attract a larger audience. They are more interesting. We get drawn into these kind of emotional stories. And thematic frames aren't quite as emotional, and so they don't draw people in the same way. And so reporters understand this, and one of the things that they do is they try and mix episodic and thematic together. tell the story to draw people in, but then give information. So I want to give you an example of a news report that uses both primarily an episodic frame, but also has a thematic frame as well.
This may be the most heartbreaking face of today's findings, the homeless children in America, like 6-month-old Mariah or 1-year-old Aaron, innocent victims caught up in their parents' problems. What would you say to Americans who think the stereotypical homeless person is a guy on the streets with a bottle in his hands?
Most Americans are just a paycheck away from being on the streets or being in a shelter like this.
Melissa Zawoski and her 4 kids learned that the hard way when she and her husband both lost their jobs at the same time. What's the hardest part of this for you?
I mean, I was being told that I could not get help.
Yolanda Daniil says she was told help was available for her and her 3 kids if she was a recovering addict, alcoholic, or ex-con. But she was a college student who lost her job.
That's not fair. What about the people who go to school every day, who work every day, and can't make ends meet?
And finding shelter can be tough. The new government study, believed to be the most accurate yet, suggests there are 300,000 more homeless people than beds in shelters and transitional housing. More than 750,000 on any given night. That's nearly the population of South Dakota. Melissa and Yolanda hope to get their names off the homeless rolls. Both are about to move into subsidized housing. Daniil, who has been in this shelter for 15 long months, is still pinching herself.
I've been getting disappointed so many times.
And praying that one day soon she'll be able to tell her children, we're going home.
So hopefully you saw the episodic part and the thematic part, right? Well, one of the interesting things about Shanto Iyengar's findings was that how people react to episodic and thematic frames turns out to be very different than what people sometimes assume. Right, we tend to assume that if people see episodic frames, they're going to be more emotionally drawn in, and then they're going to be more likely to take action. That thematic frames are not quite as emotionally compelling, and so they're going to be less likely to motivate people to take action. What he found out was something quite different. That what he found out was that when people see episodic frames, they tend to blame the individual for the situation that they're in. So in the case of the homelessness guy that I was talking about before, they tend to blame the homelessness guy for being in the situation that he's in. Do something about it, change things, go to College of the Canyons, get an education, do something. How about you when you were watching the video that we just saw? Were you blaming the women for the situation that they were in? Were you thinking, well, do something about it? Right? It turns out that when people see episodic frames, that's the tendency. When they see thematic frames, on the other hand, they tend to think that society, not necessarily the government always, but society should take some sort of action. So again, it might be you call up a congressman, or you call up a council person, or you call up somebody to do something, but it may be a church group or a synagogue or a mosque you organize people, or maybe it's people in your community that you know to put together something, or an organization that you belong to. So how people respond to episodic frames turns out to be different than thematic frames. Now, one of the things that Iyengar did point out is a lot of times the way people respond to episodic frames has to do with what he calls racially coded reports. So if something has to deal with gang violence, or if something has to do with drug use, or if something has to do with crime, that people frequently see those as issues pertaining to race, and in cases like that, they're more likely to blame the individual. So it wasn't across all news coverage. So for example, if somebody did a news report about a veteran who's had lost both arms because he dove on a grenade to save his comrades in arms, people aren't going to blame the veteran for jumping on the hand grenade. But there are some instances where people will blame the individual for the circumstance they're in. And that's why reporters generally try and use episodic frames and thematic frames to get the advantage of both of them. The episodic frame to draw the audience in, the thematic frame to tell the bigger story and hopefully motivate people to take some action. And as you watch news coverage, you'll start to see this more and more. You've probably never thought about news coverage in terms of episodic and thematic frames. Over the rest of the semester, as you're watching news coverage, if you watch news coverage, see if you notice it. And if you do, let's talk about it.